Last lecture we left off with the Texas Rebellion and the annexation of Texas into the United States. And I finished by saying that really infuriated Mexico. Um, and so they recalled their ambassador from America, right? They kind of cut off diplomatic ties with the United States. And they were very angry over this because it was kind of clearly seen as an attempt by the United States to take land that really should have been part of Mexico and that Mexico felt they should not have lost. But President Polk, right, kind of the poster child that we mentioned before of Manifest Destiny, saw an opportunity to gain even more land from Mexico as a result of kind of everything happening. They saw Mexico was weak. During this time in Mexico, you have also political revolution and tension and instability happening within Mexico itself. And so by the time the Mexican-American War actually happens, Santa Anna is actually in exile, no longer the leader. Although he eventually comes back as a result of President Polk. It's a little confusing, but just to show you that there's really a lot of instability happening in Mexico. And so President Polk sees this as an opportunity to gain more land. And he's very hawkish, right? And if someone's hawkish, it means they're very aggressive. And he's very aggressive, kind of wanting to justify going to war with Mexico in order to gain territory, right? And to kind of respond to the tensions happening, President Polk sends a man named Zachary Taylor, an important general, and an important name because Zachary Taylor will become president of the United States after the Mexican-American War. But he sends General Zachary Taylor to the Rio Grande, which is the river, the natural border between Mexico and the United States. Although at this point it was kind of conflicted. This was not yet part of the United States. And just to go back to this for a second, this image here, the Rio Grande, as you can see, is kind of runs along the modern day border, but there's still plenty of land disputed between Texas and Mexico, and Texas now in the United States. And so Polk sends General Taylor, Zachary Taylor, to the Rio Grande, which, according to Mexico, is well within their territorial claims, right? And so that's going to lead to tension, right? In addition, a man named John C. Fremont leads an expedition of men into California, which at this time was also part of Mexico, and blatantly violating Mexican sovereignty, right? Because they're with, armed men from a different country are now in Mexican territory. And so kind of tension rises, and then Mexican troops actually attack Zachary Taylor's troops. There's like a small skirmish, and a few American troops are killed. And this gives Polk kind of the necessary ammunition, right, to kind of get Congress fired up. And in 1846, the U.S. Congress declares war. So the Mexican-American War begins in 1846. And so while technically the Mexicans might have been the first to physically attack the U.S. soldiers, it really was kind of Polk inciting them, President Polk and the U.S. Army inciting this to start in order to give them justification to actually go to war. The American army is kind of much better than the Mexican army, even if not popular numbers wise. They are kind of more technology. They're better organized. There's a lot of, like I said, political instability in Mexico. So there's a lot of debate over, which general should be in charge, right? And people maybe not listening to the generals. And so there's not really a unified Mexican force. It just allows Americans to easily gain territory. A man named Colonel Stephen Kearny marches to New Mexico and actually takes control of the New Mexico province without any violence. In fact, many upper-class Mexican families, wealthy Spanish families, actually wanted to join the U.S., saw more economic benefit and gain from joining the U.S. than from remaining part of Mexico. In addition, out in California, Fremont and his supporters that were there take control of the town of Sonoma, which is near San Francisco, and they declare California an independent republic. And they managed to push the Mexican troops out, and so they established the Republic of California. So just similarly to Texas, how Texas first became a republic, its own country technically, before joining the United States, California is actually the same way. During the Mexican-American War, they claimed to be themselves an independent country, the Republic of California. And here's kind of the flag they use, right? And it's still the flag of California to this day, right? Kind of that pride of this point in their history. The United States then kind of goes one step further. Instead of just taking over lands that would be part of eventually the United States, kind of clearly the contested lands to begin with, they go even further and they invade solid Mexican territory, completely Mexican, where there's little to no white settlement, and they go as far south as the capital of Mexico, which is Mexico City, which is pretty far south before Mexico finally surrenders. But in this Mexican-American War, it's important for the manifest destiny aspect and the fact that the United States gains control of vast new territories and kind of manages to create what we understand really to be the modern United States. But it's also important because there's a lot of important military leaders that are going to pop up again in American history. So, like we mentioned, Zachary Taylor shortly after this becomes president, although his presidency is short-lived because he dies while in office. But we also have the man Robert E. Lee. If that name sounds familiar to you, he's one of the leading generals of the Confederate Army during the Civil War. Ulysses S. Grant and Winfield Scott are two of the major leaders of the Union Army during the Civil War, right? So these leaders kind of are getting their experience, these generals are getting their experience in fighting during the Mexican-American War, and that's going to be utilized about 13 years later in the Civil War, right? But they reach as far south as Mexico City, capturing it and forcing the Mexican government to surrender. And so the United States gains a very favorable treaty, which is the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, that was signed on February 2nd, 1848. And in this treaty, Mexico agrees to the Rio Grande as the border between the United States and Mexico, so the current southern border is there. They also cede control of the New Mexico territory in California. And in return for that territory, the U.S. paid Mexico $15 million, right? So it's a lot of money back then, but certainly worth it. If basing it, if you divide that kind of by acre, it's almost nothing for the land. And this territory of New Mexico is more than just the state of New Mexico, right? It includes the modern-day states of California, New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, Nevada, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming. So a vast territory of land that is now undisputedly the United States. In return for this land, they gave $15 million. They also guaranteed the Mexican residents living there freedom of religion, because again, right, the predominant religion of the United States at this time are Protestant Christianity, and Mexicans are overwhelmingly Catholic. They also promised them bilingual elections, right, giving them access to the government through Spanish means, which is interesting. Open borders, allowing them to kind of move in and pass across the Rio Grande without problem, and protection of property as well, right? They weren't going to take the property away from these Mexican families living there. So kind of Mexico kind of tries to do right by the people that they were essentially giving up as a result of this treaty. And the Mexican-American War and the few years that follow it are pretty important because they helped to establish the modern American borders that we have today, excluding obviously Alaska and Hawaii, right? What we call the lower 48 states, the contiguous 48 states, which is all the states that are connected here. This is the final borders are made during this period of manifest destiny, almost overwhelmingly during the presidency of James Polk. So like we mentioned earlier in the unit, the Webster-Ashburton Treaty, which establishes the borders of Maine and Minnesota. So up here, right, and up here, that's settled in 1842. The Oregon Treaty, again signed by reached under the administration of President Polk, establishes the 49th parallel here as the borderline, right, of the United States, which is still the case today. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848 gains kind of all this territory to the United States. And then in 1853, another additional purchase, this one not a war, but kind of a purchase, a diplomatic purchase from Mexico, is the Gadsden Purchase, named after the man, kind of the diplomat who was in charge of that, is signed by the next president, not Polk, but Franklin Pierce, who kind of follows after Taylor. And this then expands U.S. territory a little bit more in the southwest by purchasing land from Mexico, right? And so by 1853, the modern borders of the United States, minus Alaska and Hawaii, right, exist in the country, right? That doesn't mean every state is a state yet, right? Because if you look at the map down here, you can notice, this should be Nevada and Utah, right? Colorado, Kansas, Oklahoma. These aren't states yet, but they're a territory that the United States claims and is undisputed in charge of. Right, this is kind of to show you a little bit closer up. This is the battle of, showing you some battles of the Mexican-American War, but in particular, I want to focus on this piece of territory here, right here, because that's actually what is acquired in the United States during the Gadsden Purchase. and kind of established the permanent borders. That's part of the states of New Mexico and um, Texas, New Mexico, and parts of Arizona, right, or gained during this Gadsden Purchase. And so when the war ends, right, the United States is now kind of from sea to sea, in charge of most of the continent, right? The middle of the continent of North America is all under American control. So it's kind of, pride in that for sure. In the next election, the Whig candidate, remember the Whig Party that was developed in response to the Democratic Republicans, put up Zachary Taylor as president, who was easily elected. And then right in the same year as that, in 1848, gold is first discovered in California. And so this establishes the California Gold Rush. And by 1849, you have this term being thrown around, the 49ers, right? It's kind of why the San Francisco 49ers are named such. These 49ers were people who in 1849 migrated into California, and they migrated into California by the thousands, right? In 1848, only about 400 people moved to California. By 1850, that number was 44,000 people moved to California. That's an astronomical increase in people. And they were all in pursuit of finding gold and making it big, right? Gaining wealth. The overwhelming majority of them don't actually discover enough gold to make them wealthy, but once there's more people there, there's more demand for things like blacksmiths or, doctors or anything, right? And so the economy of California actually booms because once all these people are here, you need jobs are needed to kind of fill the needs of those people. And so it leads to California kind of booming population-wise and economically. You also have a lot of Asian immigrants, right, coming into the United States, which is different than what Americans were used to, right? They're used to overwhelmingly European immigrants coming into the United States on the East Coast. In the South, you kind of have interactions with Mexican and Spanish immigrants. And now on the West Coast, you have interaction with Asian immigrants. Right? This document kind of shows well the hysteria that comes around the gold rush, right? People are kind of demanding, right, and trying to get to California in any way possible, right? So most people got on the ship here. There's one man so desperate he's willing to try to swim to California, right? And this man invents some flying machine at the time, right? Planes did not exist. This was kind of science fiction at the time, to get to California, right? Any way possible to get there, to strike it big and to make some money. Right, and so California kind of quickly becomes a very populous state, and a pretty diverse state, because like I said, you have a lot of these Asian immigrants who really aren't in many other places in the United States. I mean, of course, New York has a few Asian immigrants because New York is the most diverse place in the United States, but in large numbers, the Asian immigrants come to California, which makes sense geographically, right, because they're closer to Asia, California, than New York would be. And at some points, in some towns, mining towns, 20%, 1/5 of the towns are actually Chinese immigrants, right? So a substantial part of the population here. White Americans are hesitant and do not like these Chinese immigrants. They intimidate them by, for example, the traditional wearing of men wearing long kind of ponytails in China. Some white Americans cut them off, right? There's also violence and murdering of some Chinese immigrants. I mean, not pleasant stuff happening. And this discrimination kind of becomes law. In 1852, California places a tax on foreign miners, right? So they tax the foreign miners more on what they find than they do for any other, native-born white American. In addition, you also have African Americans coming in large numbers. At first, some slaves are being brought over as well. But when California becomes a state in 1849, they actually, in the Constitution, outlaw slavery. So it joins the Union, controversially, again, because there's sectional disagreements over slavery, but eventually it joins the United States as a state and as a free state. And so again, this debate over free versus slave states, and that tension is only going to get worse because the more territory you have, the more states you're going to develop, and then the more opportunities there are for this debate to happen. And actually in 1850, this debate gets pretty brutal and bloody in the 1850s in places like Kansas and Nebraska, right? And so by this point, 1849, we're just about 12 years away from the Civil War, right? And so this tension is continuing to build up and will have important consequences for that Civil War that's going to happen in just over a decade.